The morning in Ravenwood had a way of arriving like a secret kept for the day alone. Slow, deliberate, and soft around the edges. Eleanor Mitchell liked it that way. She lingered at the kitchen window with a mug cupped in both hands, watching the small town wake as though from a long nap, the bakery sign swinging its tired welcome, a paper boy folding the same route into habit, the maple trees along Elm Drive shrugging off the last of night's mist. Inside the house the light seemed to know its place, spilling across the hardwood like an old friend and making the dust motes hang in the air as if they were listening. Eleanor moved through the morning with the quiet certainty of someone who had practiced being still for many winters. Precise motions, modest flourishes, a life threaded with habits that felt as if they had been sewn by a careful hand. She arranged the toast, set the small jar of homemade jam within reach, and laid out David's lunch like a neat little promise on the counter. The ritual steadied her, small ordinary things that held the ring of the sacred. They were anchors on waters that often threatened to run away somewhere darker. When David kissed her cheek, his lips light and hurried as always, there was no tremor in his goodbye, only the polite briskness of a man who had already put some part of himself elsewhere. He slipped into his jacket, checked his phone as if reading news that had not yet landed in her knowing, and left with the engine's muted cough. The door closed with a soft click that sounded loud in the house. She watched the driveway for a moment, mindful not to stare, careful not to let the worry overtake the morning's grace. She opened her Bible, only a small book, corners thumbed, ribbon faded from many foldings, and let her fingers rest on Proverbs 15 verse 3, "The eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good." She read the verse aloud in the hush, and the words felt like a lantern held up to a path she could not yet see. Prayer was not always the dramatic bending of the knee for Eleanor. More often it was a soft, steady murmur, a daily framing of the day's small uncertainties into the larger work of a life entrusted to something steady and unseen. Today her prayer was spare and specific, a handful of whispered petitions, protection for a husband who was sometimes lost to himself, wisdom for a woman whose job required discernment, patience to wait without losing her footing. She placed the Bible on the counter, smoothed the linen napkin, and let herself inhale, counting her breaths like beads. It was not resignation that settled on her. It was the opposite. The deliberate, stubborn kind of hope that refuses to hurry because it knows some things must be watched slowly, like bread rising, like truth forming from dough under a warm cloth. Eleanor's walk to Braden & Co. was a short one, a stone's throw through a neighborhood where porches remembered decades of neighbors and every mailbox seemed to have its own personality. The firm's building sat on Main Street like a ship that had dropped anchor in a harbor it meant to serve, solid brick, tall windows, a plaque out front with the founder's name polished by the path of many hands. She liked the way the office smelled in the morning. It carried a faint tang of paper and espresso, the steady human scent of people arriving to do honest work. As HR manager, she moved through the space with an easy authority earned by years of listening more than speaking. People came to her with problems that weren't in any handbook, marriages fraying at the edges, employees cowed by unpaid bills, young designers terrified of failing in front of clients. She had learned to hold questions like warm stones, acknowledging the heat without getting burned. Her desk was tidy by design. There were small collections, an old fountain pen with a dented cap, a picture of her and David laughing in a rainstorm years back, a pot of winter rosemary, objects that said softly, "This is a life being kept." She checked the inbox and walked the rumor currents that always swirled in any office. Talk of project bids, a flaring ego in the drafting room, the occasional personality whose spark could be both boon and hazard. She knew the company's pulse in a way that was nearly physiological. She could feel a rumor like a skipped heartbeat and knew whether to let it pass like a bird or to follow it to its nest. Today her attention rested on the calendar. Year-end reviews were near, and the company would soon be talking about bonuses. It was a season that brought joy and temptation in equal measure. Eleanor had shepherded bonuses before. She had watched grateful recipients plan small celebrations and larger dreams, and she had also watched how windfalls could bend a person toward choices that left their better selves in the shadows. She made a mental inventory: fairness, transparency, documentation. Her thumb traced the edge of the approval stamp on her desk, steady as the promise she felt she owed to both the firm and the souls who trusted her stewardship. Her work required candor paired with compassion, the rare balance where truth did not shred people but helped them stand straighter. She would be called to sign papers, to bless rewards earned, and she would do it with the unassuming reverence of someone who knew currency could build and it could crumble, and her job was to see it did neither by accident. Between emails she paused 3 times in the morning to breathe and say a short prayer, a practice she kept not out of habit alone but because prayer had taught her to see beneath the surface. "The Lord will fight for you, you need only to be still," she murmured, thinking of Exodus 14 verse 14, and the sentence felt like a small iron blade of truth, sharp enough to cut through worry if she would only let it. At noon the office hummed with the soft symphony of productive lives. The clack of keyboards, the low drone of conversation, the laughter that sometimes popped out like light through cloud. Eleanor ate her salad at her desk, but she listened more than she chewed. That was part of her craft. People were like open books in this town, sometimes with the good margins showing, sometimes with the margins dog-eared and stained, and she had learned to read the pauses. It was in the pauses where she caught the things that weren't said. She noticed the way David's name sat differently on the staff roster lately, there present, but with a new distance she couldn't quantify. He was the kind of man who had once left sticky notes for her on the bathroom mirror, small declarations of affection written in a hand she knew intimately. Those notes had become less frequent as his projects grew, as client dinners multiplied, as his professional ambitions began to eat at the edges of their evenings. Eleanor did not spy, she observed with a professional's restraint. She could have let a small green vine of worry unfurl into jealousy, allowing resentment to take root, but she had seen too many lives consumed by such vines. Instead, she turned inward and redoubled her prayers, asking the same God who had promised to be near the broken to visit the frayed edges of their marriage. She remembered a line from Psalm 46 verse 10, "Be still and know that I am God," and sat with it like a lodestar. Her stillness was not a blankness, it was a thing full of attention. She began to catalog the little changes, noting them down like specimens in a jar. David's later hours, his distracted sighs, the way he sometimes tapped his pen when he thought no one was looking. Each note was not an indictment but a map. She did not intend to follow it into accusation but to understand where the route might lead so she could walk it with feet that would be steady when the path became rough. At 3 she walked to the window and watched the light shift. The town seemed to hold its breath and she felt the same way, suspended on the edge of something that had not yet declared itself. The sense of waiting was not passive, it was an active kind of readiness, like a gardener leaning toward the soil before planting, feeling the weather in her bones and trusting that the right time for action would come. As afternoon gave way to the purple light of evening, Eleanor closed her planner and sat a little longer at her desk, letting the day settle like flour after sifting. She allowed herself the indulgence of a slow exhale and pulled the thin Bible from the drawer, its cover soft from years in which it had been a companion rather than a talisman. Her fingers slipped open to a familiar verse and she read quietly, "Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all." Psalm 34 verse 19. The verse wrapped around her like a shawl, comforting without diminishing the weight of what lay ahead. The office emptied with the soft economy of routine. Chairs scraped, lights switched off, and the building exhaled. Outside, the sky softened into colors that looked as if an artist had borrowed gentle hands from memory, pale amber and lavender threaded together. David texted, asking when she'd be home. She replied with a smiley face and the words, "Soon." She folded a card into her wallet, old and worn, with a note David had once slipped under her pillow, simple words of thanks for something she had done years ago. The note was a relic that reminded her not of past complacency but of a foundation they had built together in quieter times. She prayed again, longer this time, not for the storm to be averted, because storms sometimes teach more than calm, but for the grace to meet whatever came with dignity. Her prayer was not loud, it was a steady current pulling at the unseen. She rose slowly, collected her belongings, and turned the office lights off one by one, feeling as though she were closing windows against a night that might yet hold revelations. She walked home under street lamps that made small halos on the pavement, legs tired and mind alert, carrying with her the quiet conviction that faith planted in patience would in time bear a crop. When Samantha Hayes arrived in Ravenwood, it was as if the quiet rhythm of the town skipped a beat. She came with the energy of someone who believed that every place existed to meet her halfway. Her first morning was draped in gold sunlight that bounced off her cherry-red car, an audacious color in a town where people preferred muted shades. She walked into Braden & Co. with a confidence that could fill a room and silence it at the same time. Her heels clicked like a metronome on the marble floor, and heads turned with curiosity that bordered on intrigue. She was young, maybe late 20s, with a voice that slid easily between charm and command, and a smile that promised stories better left untold. In her interview, she spoke about ambition as if it were a virtue carved into her soul. The management saw a spark and hired her without second thought. She was assigned to the design department, David Mitchell's department. That very afternoon, Samantha walked over to David's desk under the pretense of clarifying her assignment. "I've heard you're one of the best here," she said with a tone that balanced admiration and subtle flirtation. David, caught off guard, returned a polite nod. "I just try to do my job," he said, though his smile stayed longer than it should have. From that moment, something invisible began to shift, something small and almost imperceptible, like a feather landing on water. Samantha had a way of lingering. She found reasons to return to David's office. Misplaced reports, client feedback she needed explained, a question about company protocol that somehow required face-to-face clarification. Eleanor, in her HR corner, saw none of this directly, yet she felt it in the currents of office chatter. She noticed how the mention of Samantha's name in meetings was accompanied by laughter just a little too eager. It wasn't malice. It was fascination, the way people are drawn to fire before they realize how easily it burns. Ravenwood had not yet seen her for what she truly was, a storm in red lipstick, graceful and disarming. And as with every storm, the first breeze was pleasant before the sky began to darken. In the weeks that followed, Samantha's presence grew like ivy on a brick wall, beautiful to look at, but persistent in its quiet claim. She made herself indispensable. She offered to stay late on projects, volunteered to help with presentations, and took coffee breaks timed perfectly with David's. People began to joke that she was his shadow, though not within Eleanor's hearing. David himself couldn't quite explain the pull. He told himself that she was merely enthusiastic, that her attention was professional admiration. But even as he convinced himself, he began to dress with a bit more care. He ironed his shirts on Sunday evenings without being asked, changed his cologne to something lighter, and smiled at his phone more often than at home. Eleanor, ever perceptive, noticed the new cologne before he said a word. It wasn't the scent that stung, it was the timing. She watched him rush out of the house in the mornings with that vague excitement of a man chasing something he couldn't name. At the office, Samantha's laughter was like glass wind chimes, delicate, bright, and always in motion. She left a trail of perfume that lingered long after she passed, subtle enough to suggest rather than declare. One afternoon, she approached David with a portfolio under her arm. "Would you look at my concept sketches?" she asked, leaning slightly closer than necessary. He obliged, unaware of how small the space between professionalism and temptation had become. She praised his feedback, laughed at his jokes, and made him feel, without ever saying it, that he was extraordinary. Pride has a sweet taste when flattery feeds it. Meanwhile, Eleanor's days became quieter, her smile smaller. She continued her prayers, sometimes in the solitude of her car before walking into work, whispering, "Lord, reveal what is hidden." It was not suspicion that drove her prayers. It was discernment. She understood that light didn't chase darkness. It simply shone until darkness retreated. The gossip in Braden & Co. began as faint ripples, harmless to the untrained ear. A few employees whispered in the cafeteria that Samantha's rise in the company seemed faster than most. Her designs weren't exceptional, they said, but her rapport with David was. In small towns like Ravenwood, words traveled without needing legs. Eleanor, sitting at her corner desk, overheard snippets when people thought she wasn't listening. "She's got him wrapped around her finger," someone muttered once. "I heard they were seen having dinner," another added. Eleanor didn't confront the talkers. She simply let the words pass through her like wind through branches. Her faith taught her that truth didn't need defending, it only needed time. Still, there were moments when the quiet in her heart trembled. At night, she'd lay in bed beside David, feeling the distance that now existed even when their bodies were inches apart. She prayed softly, fingers clutching the sheets like the hem of Christ's garment, whispering verses from the Psalms. "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." She prayed not just for herself but for him, for his clarity, his soul, his weakness. There was no bitterness in her plea, only hope mixed with ache. Sometimes she'd glance at his phone glowing faintly on the nightstand, and though temptation whispered, she never touched it. She believed that if something was meant to be revealed, God himself would bring it to light. In those nights of half-sleep, she dreamed of oceans, vast, endless, calm on the surface but full of restless tides below. That was her marriage now, beautiful from a distance but unpredictable underneath. Yet even in her dreams there was a voice reminding her, "Be still and know that I am God." She held on to that stillness like a raft. Samantha, for her part, was not a woman driven merely by affection. Her charm was calculated. Her interest in David served a purpose she hadn't entirely named but instinctively pursued. Maybe it was power, or validation, or the thrill of winning where others feared to tread. She had grown up learning that admiration could be turned into currency and that flattery, used correctly, could unlock doors faster than effort. David was not her first experiment in that lesson, just the most consequential. She studied him the way architects study blueprints, tracing weaknesses, anticipating cracks. She knew how to make him feel seen, how to make him believe that she understood him in ways his wife no longer did. Her praise was never exaggerated, it was measured, almost surgical. She'd say, "You make design sound like poetry," or, "No one listens like you do." Little phrases, seemingly harmless, that fed the hunger pride often disguises as need. But what Samantha didn't know was that her charm had awakened something far more dangerous than desire in David. It had awakened guilt, the kind that follows a man home and sits quietly beside him at dinner. Eleanor felt that presence, though David never confessed. She watched him bless his food but never his heart. Each time she saw him lost in thought, her own soul grew tender rather than angry. She knew temptation's face came in many forms, and sometimes, prayer was the only shield thin enough to fit beneath the skin. In her office one quiet afternoon, while others chatted by the coffee machine, Eleanor bowed her head and prayed, "Lord, keep him even when he doesn't ask you to." Her words were like arrows released into unseen battle. Somewhere in the heavenlies, she believed, those prayers struck their mark. And though Samantha thought she was weaving a net of seduction, she didn't realize that Eleanor's prayer was already unraveling the threads. Winter came to Ravenwood with the quiet confidence of something ancient returning home. The town shifted under its touch, rooftops powdered in white, streets lined with frost that sparkled beneath the soft hum of street lamps. At Braden & Co., the season carried with it a different kind of anticipation, the kind that made hearts race and tongues whisper. The announcement of year-end bonuses was just around the corner, and the entire building seemed to buzz with restrained hope. For Eleanor, the season had always represented both gratitude and caution. As HR manager, she carried the weight of trust that came with signing every approval, her pen the final gate between expectation and reward. On the morning the bonus files landed on her desk, she brewed her coffee stronger than usual and allowed herself a small prayer before touching the papers. The snow fell lazily outside her window as she began to review the list, each name bringing to mind faces she'd guided through promotions, reprimands, and personal struggles. She read them with a mother's patience and an accountant's eye, ensuring every figure mirrored both fairness and merit. When she reached David Mitchell's file, her hand hesitated, not from doubt, but from the gravity of intimacy colliding with duty. His name, written in neat serif print, felt heavier than the rest. $15,000, his reward for a year of innovation and persistence. She knew he had worked hard. She also knew how success could tempt even the steadiest heart. A faint smile curved her lips as she signed the document, the same way a believer might nod before walking into a trial they could not yet name. She placed her pen down gently and whispered, "Lord, let this be a blessing, not a burden." Beyond the glass walls of her office, the world continued its rhythm, unaware that a signature, simple as it seemed, had just written the preface to a revelation that would test every vow she had ever made. David received the bonus email late that afternoon, and for the first time in months he felt genuinely proud of himself. The message from Eleanor, sent through official channels, was brief and professional. "Congratulations on your performance bonus. Keep up the good work." It was signed E. Mitchell, the same way all her correspondences were. He read it twice, the name pulling at something soft inside him, a reminder of the woman whose loyalty he had begun to take for granted. He sat back in his chair, staring at the screen until Samantha's voice broke his reverie. "Big day?" she asked, appearing at his cubicle with a playful grin. Her lipstick matched the red folder she carried, and her eyes, bright and curious, seemed to know the answer already. "Bonus season," he replied, shrugging in an attempt at nonchalance. "Ah, the rewards of the righteous," she teased, resting one arm on the divider. "You deserve it, David. You've worked harder than anyone here." Her words fell like honey on his conscience, sweet, soothing, and dangerous. He laughed, not because it was funny, but because he didn't know what else to do with the warmth creeping up his neck. By the end of the day, she had convinced him to celebrate. Nothing extravagant, she promised, just dinner, just friends. But dinner turned into drinks, and drinks turned into laughter that blurred the edges of reason. When the bill arrived, Samantha hesitated just long enough for David to offer to pay. "I've got it," he said, his hand moving toward his wallet before his mind could protest. That night, in the dim glow of the restaurant's last light, something shifted between them. The small moral fences he had built around himself began to loosen. Pride whispered that he had earned the right to indulge, to feel seen, to be admired. Yet somewhere deep beneath that whisper, guilt stirred like a restless sleeper. When he returned home past midnight, Eleanor was asleep on the couch, Bible open beside her, a lamp burning low. He stood there for a moment, torn between gratitude and shame, before turning the light off and climbing the stairs. He told himself it was just one dinner. He didn't yet know that small compromises often carry the weight of entire downfalls. Samantha's plan, though unspoken, unfolded with a kind of precision that could only belong to someone who understood how to use affection as leverage. In the days that followed, she made sure to be near David, not in a way that drew suspicion, but with enough presence to remind him of her interest. She brought him coffee with a teasing smile, left handwritten notes thanking him for guidance, and asked about his weekend plans as if she had a right to know. The walls between them, once defined by professionalism, began to blur into dangerous intimacy. She would linger at his desk long after others had gone home, asking for feedback on design ideas she already knew were perfect. Each time he looked up from his computer, she met his gaze with that deliberate softness that disarmed him. He told himself it was harmless, that her admiration was the harmless warmth of camaraderie. But admiration, when fed by vanity, can bloom into a hunger that reason alone cannot starve. On a gray Friday afternoon, David received his bonus deposit, a neat $15,000 sitting in his account like a promise of redemption. He stared at the number with disbelief, thinking of how far he'd come from the struggling architect he once was. When Samantha asked how he'd celebrate, he laughed it off, though the idea of spoiling her had already planted its seed. "I'll buy you dinner," he joked. She tilted her head, eyes glinting. "You mean you'll let me thank you properly?" The next evening she led him to a boutique instead of a restaurant, claiming she needed help choosing a gift for her sister. By the time they left, she had several bags swinging from her arm, clothes she didn't need, all paid for with his card. "You're too generous," she said, and though she laughed, she knew she had won another inch of his conscience. That night, she posted pictures of her new purchases online, the captions vague but self-satisfied. Meanwhile, Eleanor knelt in prayer beside her bed, unaware of how the money she had approved was now fueling deception. Her voice was soft as she prayed, "Lord, let no secret survive your light." The words lingered in the room long after she rose, as though heaven itself was waiting for its cue to intervene. By the end of the month, the ripple effects of that bonus had reached every corner of their lives. Samantha's spending grew bolder, designer shoes, perfume that smelled like temptation, a vacation she justified as self-care. David's guilt, once a dull ache, now throbbed like an open wound. He avoided Eleanor's gaze at breakfast, his words clipped and hurried. He stopped joining her for prayer in the evenings, claiming fatigue. She didn't press him, she only prayed harder. The house had grown quieter, yet beneath the silence was a storm gathering its breath. Eleanor began noticing small things. The new cufflinks he hadn't bought with her, the unfamiliar scent clinging to his coat, the way his phone vibrated silently and was snatched up before she could glance at it. Still she said nothing. Her restraint was not ignorance, it was the patience of someone who trusted divine timing more than confrontation. Each morning she would whisper, "Search me, O God, and know my heart, try me and know my thoughts." It was both a prayer and a shield. The office too began to shift. Samantha's laughter became louder, her confidence sharper, as if she were testing how far she could push before the edges tore. The bonus that had once seemed like a blessing now pulsed through their world like poison disguised as perfume. One Friday, as David packed his bag, Eleanor called out gently, "Don't forget the envelope you left on the dresser." He froze. "Which one?" he asked. "The one marked blessings," she said with a smile. It was the bonus receipt she had filed away, his name signed beneath hers. She didn't elaborate and he didn't ask. But as he walked out, the verse she'd underlined that morning echoed through her mind, Galatians 6 verse 7. "Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." She didn't know when the harvest would come, only that it would. And when it did, truth would bloom through every layer of deceit, no matter how deep it had been buried. The evening of the winter gala arrived like a scene painted by the hands of anticipation itself. The air in Ravenwood carried a crisp stillness that seemed to pause even the breath of trees. The sky, stretched in deep indigo, was sprinkled with early stars that glimmered like quiet witnesses to what the night was about to unveil. Eleanor stood in front of the mirror, fastening a delicate silver clasp at her neck. Her dress was an elegant emerald green that caught the light like water when she moved, simple, refined, and deeply dignified. She didn't wear extravagance, she wore grace. David, dressed in a charcoal suit, watched her from the doorway with an expression that flickered somewhere between admiration and guilt. The silence between them was no longer comfortable. It hummed with things unsaid. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice a touch too soft. "Thank you," she replied, and though her tone was polite, her eyes reflected something unreadable, like still water concealing deep current. On their drive to the country hall, the road wound through the sleeping town, past lampposts casting small halos of amber light on the snow-dusted pavement. David's hands on the steering wheel were tense, and the sound of the tires on asphalt filled the space where conversation might have lived. Eleanor looked out of the window, her fingers tracing invisible shapes on the frost-lined glass. Inside her heart, prayer whispered like a heartbeat. "Lord," she said silently, "let the truth come as softly as snow, yet fall where it must." When they reached the venue, the building stood aglow, grand but not imposing, alive with laughter, chatter, and music that floated gently through its doors. The winter gala had always been the highlight of Braden and Company's year. A time for acknowledgement, for reflection, for masks both literal and unseen. Tonight, however, Eleanor knew that some masks might not survive the evening. And though she didn't yet know how or when the light would reach what was hidden, she trusted that it would. Because light, by its nature, cannot be kept away forever. Inside the ballroom, the air shimmered with the soft elegance of celebration. Crystal chandeliers hung like constellations, casting a golden glow upon faces flushed with laughter and wine. Waiters moved through the crowd with silver trays, carrying glasses that clinked softly like the echo of distant bells. The hum of conversation created an orchestra of human presence, every note sincere, every pause deliberate. Eleanor walked beside David, poised, her every movement measured like the rhythm of a hymn. Around her, colleagues offered warm greetings, their smiles genuine, yet their eyes curious. They admired her composure, unaware of the quiet storm beneath it. When Samantha Hayes entered, heads turned almost in unison. She arrived dressed in crimson, her gown bold, her confidence blazing. The jewels around her neck sparkled like tiny betrayals under the chandelier light. She smiled, the kind of smile that drew attention before it earned it. David stiffened beside Eleanor. She felt the shift instantly, the way his breathing hitched, the subtle flicker in his gaze. Without turning to look at him, she reached for her champagne glass, her fingers steady, her heart whispering another prayer. "Deliver me from envy, Lord, that I may stand upright even among deceit." Samantha crossed the room with deliberate grace, her laughter bright and practiced. She greeted David warmly, her voice dripping with false familiarity. "Mr. Mitchell," she said almost teasing, "you clean up nicely." Eleanor smiled politely, the picture of civility. "He always does," she answered, her voice light but edged with quiet strength. Their exchange drew a few glances, but no one dared linger on what they didn't understand. For a moment, The three stood locked in an invisible triangle of tension and silence, each one aware of the unspoken truths humming beneath the polite veneer of small talk. Somewhere in the background, the band began to play a slow waltz. Couples moved to the floor, their laughter blending with the music. Eleanor watched the dancers, her mind steady as a scripture. For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. Luke 8 verse 17. She didn't need to expose anyone. She only needed to wait. Dinner was served with the precision of ritual. Fine china, polished silver, courses that arrived in perfect rhythm. Laughter rose and fell like waves around the table, yet beneath it all, Eleanor felt an invisible tremor, an undercurrent that only she seemed to hear. The company's founder, Mr. Braden, sat at the head, his white hair gleaming under the chandelier's light. He was a man of warmth and principle, one who believed that gratitude must always be spoken aloud. After the last course was cleared, he stood, lifting his glass with the authority of both age and leadership. Before we raise a final toast, he began, let us take a moment to honor those who carry the quiet weight of our success. The room quieted and every face turned toward him. This year has been remarkable, he continued, and none of it would have been possible without integrity, without people who ensure fairness flows like the lifeblood of this company. His eyes found Eleanor and a smile crept across his face. Mrs. Mitchell, he said warmly, our heart in human resources. Every employee's bonus this year passed through her careful hands. Her signature is our assurance that hard work is rewarded justly. The applause that followed filled the room like thunder muffled by velvet. Eleanor inclined her head in gratitude, her expression serene. But across the table the sound struck David like a blow. His fingers tightened around his glass. Samantha's smile faltered, confusion flashing across her face as realization began to dawn. The applause faded, replaced by the quiet hum of people returning to their conversations. Yet something irreversible had already been set in motion. David's thoughts raced, the bonus, the money he had given away, the woman beside him who had approved it. Guilt flooded him so suddenly that even his posture betrayed him. Eleanor, ever composed, lifted her glass. To integrity, she said softly, her voice carrying farther than the words deserved. The toast rippled through the table and as she drank, her eyes met Samantha's. There was no hatred there, no smugness, only a calm certainty, like still waters reflecting light. Samantha looked away first, her laughter forced as she reached for her drink. Eleanor's prayer had been answered, though not in thunder or lightning, but in revelation born of silence. As the night deepened and music softened to a gentle murmur, the glow of the evening began to dim in David's heart. He stood by the window overlooking the snowy courtyard, the reflection of string lights dancing across his pale face. Behind him, laughter and conversation continued, but he could no longer hear it as joy. It sounded distant, hollow. His mind was replaying every choice, every lie told through omission, every moment when he had chosen pride over truth. He could see Samantha across the room, her earlier confidence now reduced to nervous glances and forced smiles. Every laugh from her lips rang false, like a bell cracked in the middle. Eleanor joined him at the window after a while, her perfume faint, familiar, and comforting in its simplicity. She stood beside him without a word, watching the snowfall outside. After a long silence, she said quietly, "You look tired." The words were not an accusation, they were an observation wrapped in grace. He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "It's been a long year," he managed, voice strained. "Yes," she agreed. "But the year always tells the truth before it ends." Her words sank deep, heavy with meaning. He turned to her, expecting anger, but found only weary compassion. In that moment, he realized that her strength had never come from pride, it had come from prayer, from the quiet certainty that no betrayal could uproot what God had already steadied within her. Somewhere in his chest, something cracked, not a collapse but the beginning of repentance. Across the room, Samantha gathered her things, her posture tense, her eyes darting toward the door. The evening had shown her a reflection she could not bear to see. Eleanor didn't stop her, didn't look back. She simply placed her hand on David's arm and whispered, "Let's go home." As they walked out together, the verse she'd read that morning echoed softly in her heart, Psalm 37 verse 6. "He will make your righteousness shine like the dawn, your vindication like the noonday sun. Outside, the snow continued to fall, pure and relentless, covering the tracks of the evening's sins with a quiet mercy that only heaven could weave. The morning after the gala dawned gray and still, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The wind outside the Mitchell home rattled the bare branches, and every creak of the old oak near the porch seemed to echo the unrest that had settled inside the house. Eleanor rose early as she always did, but her movements were slower, deliberate, her spirit still wrapped in the echoes of the night before. She had slept little, though she had not wept. Instead, she had lain awake, listening to the silence between her and David, a silence thick enough to carry 1,000 confessions. She brewed coffee, the scent filling the kitchen, grounding her in routine. When David came down the stairs, his face was pale, his eyes hollow from a night spent wrestling with ghosts he could not name. He sat opposite her at the table, unable to meet her gaze. "Rough night?" she asked softly, her voice gentle, her hands folded over her Bible. He nodded, a motion barely perceptible. "You were quiet at the end," she continued, not accusing, merely observing. He hesitated, then whispered, "There are things I can't explain, Eleanor." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression calm yet unreadable. "Then don't explain them," she said, closing her Bible. "Let them reveal themselves." It wasn't anger that colored her tone. It was faith, a faith not in him, but in the God who would bring what was hidden into light. She stood and touched his shoulder briefly, an act of grace he did not deserve, and then walked out of the room. Upstairs, she prayed quietly, her voice trembling with exhaustion yet steady in conviction. "Lord," she whispered, "teach me to wait without bitterness. Teach me to stand while you uncover what I cannot." Downstairs, David sat frozen in shame, realizing that his wife's restraint was more powerful than any confrontation could ever be. In her silence, he saw a mirror, and in that mirror, he saw the man he had become, small and lost. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, as though heaven had begun its slow work of cleansing. By mid-morning, Ravenwood's calm was broken by the murmur of gossip that flowed like a low current through the corridors of Braden and Company. The gala had been the talk of the office, not for its grandeur, but for the lingering tension that no one could quite name aloud. Rumors, as they always did, filled in the blanks truth had not yet spoken. Samantha arrived late, her face painted with the remnants of confidence that no longer belonged to her. She walked through the office halls with her head held high, but every footstep felt heavier than the last. The glances that followed her were not of admiration this time, they were curious, cautious, and edged with quiet judgment. Eleanor watched from her glass office as Samantha made her way to her desk, her own expression unreadable. She had prayed before stepping into the building that morning, prayed for wisdom and control. "If justice must be done," she had said softly, "let it wear your face, Lord, not mine." When the time came for her to act, it did not arrive as a decision, but as calm certainty. By noon, the financial review team sent over a flagged report. A series of irregular transactions connected to employee accounts had surfaced, small amounts at first, but then larger transfers that had drawn attention. Eleanor's heart beat steadily, but her hands did not tremble. The paper trail led directly to David's bonus account and then outward to Samantha Hayes. The revelation wasn't a shock, it was confirmation of what her prayers had already prepared her to face. She read the report once, closed the folder, and sat in silence for a long time. In that stillness she felt no rage, only clarity. God had a way of letting truth rise through the cracks, no matter how deep deceit was buried. The words from Proverbs 10 verse 9 floated into her mind. "Whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but whoever takes crooked paths will be found out." She called Samantha to her office, her tone polite, her voice steady. "Come in, Samantha," she said when the knock came. "Close the door behind you." Samantha stepped into the room as if she were entering a courtroom, though the judge before her carried no gavel, only grace. The office was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Eleanor gestured toward the chair across from her. "Sit," she said gently. Samantha obeyed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The silence stretched, thick and deliberate. When Eleanor finally did, her voice was calm, almost kind. "We're conducting a financial compliance review," she began, sliding a folder across the desk. There are a few transactions that need clarification. Samantha hesitated before opening the folder. Her eyes scanned the documents, her face draining of color as recognition struck. There it was, her name tied to the very money she had spent so carelessly. I don't know what this is," she stammered. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady. "You spent a man's bonus not knowing his wife approved it." The words hung in the air like a bell tolling at a funeral. Samantha's breath hitched. "I didn't mean," she began, but the sentence died on her tongue. Eleanor raised a hand, not in anger, but as a quiet command for honesty. "I don't need excuses," she said. "I only need the truth." Tears welled in Samantha's eyes, spilling before she could stop them. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear I didn't know it was you." Eleanor nodded slowly. "That much is clear," she replied, her voice even. "But ignorance does not make theft less real." There was no satisfaction in her tone, no triumph. Only the steady authority of a woman who understood that judgment, when done right, is not vengeance, it's balance. She slid an envelope toward Samantha. "This is your release letter," she said. "Effective immediately." Samantha stared at it, her hands trembling, the weight of her choices pressing down like a mountain. Before she left, Eleanor spoke again, softer now, as though addressing not just Samantha, but something greater. "Proverbs 11 verse 3, she murmured. "The integrity of the upright guides them, but the crookedness of the treacherous destroys them." Samantha left without another word, the sound of her heels fading into the hallway like the echo of a warning carried by time itself. The afternoon passed in quiet consequence. Eleanor sat at her desk long after the sun began to sink, the light outside fading into a bruised orange that matched the weariness settling in her bones. The building emptied one by one, voices fading, laughter softening, until the only sound left was the faint hum of the heating vent. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling both the ache and relief that come when truth has finally done its work. Down the street, the church bells of St. Augustine's began to ring the hour, their sound gentle and familiar. She rose, went to the window, and watched as the first stars appeared above the town. Her reflection in the glass looked older somehow, tired but unbroken. Behind her, the office was immaculate, every file in its place, every surface clear, as though the act of setting things right extended even to the room itself. She whispered a prayer of thanksgiving, not for the downfall of another, but for the preservation of her own spirit. "Lord," she said, "thank you for teaching me that stillness is not weakness. Thank you for letting your justice speak through my silence." She thought of David then, not as the man who had wronged her, but as someone still trapped in his own web of regret. She prayed for him too, because forgiveness, she knew, was not an event but a journey, one step at a time. When she finally turned off the lights, the office was bathed in the glow of the city's reflection, soft, dim, and pure. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world blanketed in white, the kind of white that suggests cleansing, not erasure. Eleanor walked out into the night, her breath visible in the cold air, her steps sure and quiet. Above her, the stars burned brighter now, as if heaven had opened its eyes in approval. And though she did not smile, there was peace in her expression, a peace born not of victory but of vindication, the kind that comes when a woman stands firm and lets faith do what fury never could. The days that followed Samantha's departure unfolded slowly, like pages in a book whose ending no one dared to read aloud. Ravenwood returned to its usual quiet rhythm, but for David and Eleanor, silence carried new meaning. It was not just the absence of sound, but the presence of reflection. Each morning, David woke earlier than before, the guilt he carried pulling him from sleep long before dawn. He would sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the gray light creeping through the curtains, listening to the steady breathing of the woman he had nearly destroyed. Sometimes he would glance at her, at the serenity that never seemed to abandon her face even when her heart had been tested. There was no scorn in her expression, no bitterness hidden behind her grace. Instead, there was something deeper, an unspoken strength that both comforted and condemned him. Eleanor, though aware of his silent penance, did not rush to speak. She had learned that remorse spoken too early could sound like a plea for pardon rather than the beginning of change. She moved through her days with her usual quiet rhythm, packing his lunch, arranging flowers on the kitchen table, keeping the home steady while his conscience did its trembling work. In the evenings, she would sit by the window with her Bible open, not as an ornament of righteousness but as her companion in stillness. One night, David stood in the doorway watching her as she whispered a verse from Isaiah 43 verse 2. "When you pass through the waters I will be with you, and through the rivers they shall not overflow you." Her voice was soft, yet it carried the weight of survival. He took a step closer, guilt tightening in his chest. "Eleanor," he said, the word breaking through his throat like something jagged. She looked up from the page, her eyes gentle but knowing. "Yes." He hesitated, the sentence trembling on his lips. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock and the hum of the night outside. Then she closed her Bible and said quietly, "You've already been forgiven, David. Now forgive yourself before it ruins what's left of you." It was not absolution. It was an invitation to rebuild, not just to regret. And in that moment, something within him shifted, small but real, like the first crack of dawn after a long storm. Spring came to Ravenwood wrapped in birdsong and the scent of wet earth. The snow melted away, uncovering sidewalks and gardens that had slept too long. For Eleanor it was more than a change of weather, it was a slow renewal, one that came not through joy but through release. She had spent the winter holding her pain like glass, careful not to let it cut her again. But spring, in its tender persistence, began to soften even that. She found herself humming while preparing dinner, smiling at small things, a neighbor's laughter, the sight of lilacs blooming by the fence, the warmth of morning sunlight brushing her face through the window. At work, colleagues looked at her differently now, not with pity, but with a quiet respect that words could not describe. They had heard whispers of what had happened, how integrity had triumphed where revenge could have ruled. Eleanor never spoke of it, but people sensed that some kind of holy justice had taken place, one that no scandal could stain. Her desk, always immaculate, now held a small vase of daisies. She said they reminded her that purity didn't mean fragility. David's repentance took the shape of action rather than promises. He stopped trying to explain and started to rebuild. He left work earlier, ate dinner with her every night, and joined her in prayer before bed, awkward at first but earnest. There were still moments when the shadow of the past stretched long between them, but Eleanor met those moments the way she met storms, with patience and with scripture. "Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things," she read from 1 Corinthians 13, her voice steady as a heartbeat. David would listen quietly, not daring to interrupt. Sometimes after she finished reading, he would reach for her hand, his fingers tentative but sincere. She no longer pulled away. Forgiveness, she realized, was not a single act. It was a rhythm, a long, slow breath that kept the soul from suffocating under the weight of memory. And so, little by little, peace began to return, not in grand declarations, but in the ordinary moments that God uses to heal what people think is beyond repair. As the weeks stretched into months, the distance between husband and wife transformed into a kind of reverent closeness, born from shared understanding rather than easy comfort. There were still scars, visible to no one but them, but those scars had become part of the story, no longer symbols of destruction but of endurance. Eleanor often thought about the strange ways grace worked. It didn't erase pain, it redeemed it. It turned betrayal into testimony, shame into soil from which humility could grow. Some evenings she would walk alone through the park near their home, where the trees now stood clothed in green. Children's laughter drifted through the air, and the scent of rain lingered like a hymn. She found herself talking to God more freely these days, not begging or questioning but simply conversing. "You knew all along, didn't you?" she whispered one evening, looking up at the canopy of leaves above her. "You knew this would break me just enough to make me stronger." The breeze rustled gently as if in response. When she returned home, she found David sitting on the porch, sketching quietly. The same hands that had once betrayed her now shaped lines of beauty, penitent and pure. "It's a chapel," he said when she asked what he was drawing. "I want to design one for the town, a place for people to remember mercy." She looked at the sketch, then at him, her heart softening. "Mercy doesn't need a building," she said softly, "but perhaps it would like a roof." He smiled, a real one this time, not the forced one of a man hiding guilt. And though they didn't speak of the past again, its lesson lingered in every word they didn't need to say. Love, Eleanor realized wasn't about avoiding storms, it was about learning to pray in the rain until the sky remembered how to clear. By summer, Ravenwood looked reborn. The gardens along Elm Drive burst with color, the air carried the hum of bees and the promise of long evenings, and even the old church bell seemed to ring with greater warmth. Eleanor's heart, too, felt lighter, no longer burdened by what had been, but lifted by what was yet to come. She began volunteering at a small community center, mentoring young women who came seeking guidance, each one carrying her own story of heartbreak, ambition, or confusion. She never shared her own ordeal in full. Instead, she spoke of patience, of prayer, of the kind of strength that wears gentleness like armor. Her words carried authority not because of eloquence, but because they were born from experience sanctified by endurance. One afternoon, as she helped a young woman fill out a scholarship form, she caught herself smiling. It struck her how the same heart that had once been cracked by betrayal was now a vessel of compassion. When she returned home that evening, David was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The aroma of roasted herbs filled the air, and music played softly from the radio. He turned toward her, wiping his hands, and said, "You're home early." She looked at him, this man who had fallen and learned to stand again, and felt a warmth that was not merely affection but gratitude. They ate together, laughing at small things, their conversation light, their silences comfortable. Later that night, as Eleanor sat by the window, the stars glittering above like fragments of eternity, she opened her Bible once more. Her eyes fell upon Psalm 34 verse 19, "Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all." She closed her eyes and whispered, "And he truly does." Outside, the crickets sang their chorus and the world, for all its imperfections, felt whole again. The woman who had once been wounded now carried peace within her, a peace that spoke softly, yet carried the power of mountains unmoved by storms. In her stillness there was victory, in her grace there was glory, and in her prayers there remained the unshakable echo of a faith that had not just survived but triumphed. My dear listeners, if you've stayed with Eleanor's story till the end, then you already know it wasn't just a story about betrayal, it was about resilience, faith, and the quiet power of prayer. Life will test your peace in ways you don't expect. Sometimes it won't be strangers who hurt you, but the very people you once prayed for. But here's the truth this story whispers to the heart: God never allows pain without purpose. Even in the moments when you feel unseen, unappreciated, or broken by deceit, heaven is still writing your deliverance. Eleanor didn't win her battle by shouting, arguing, or fighting. She won it by kneeling. She found her strength where real strength lives, in prayer. You may not always have control over who betrays you, but you do have control over how you rise afterward. Rise in dignity. Rise in silence. Rise in prayer. Remember, some storms come not to destroy you, but to reveal who you truly are and to prove that what God planted in you cannot be uprooted by anyone's lies. If you are going through something heavy right now, don't let bitterness sit in your heart. Replace it with peace. Don't let the world harden you, let it teach you how to shine quietly through grace. Now let's pray together from your heart to heaven. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the story of strength and faith you've spoken through Eleanor's life. For every listener under the sound of this prayer, I ask that you breathe peace where there has been pain. Father, mend every heart that has been bruised by betrayal, every home that has grown cold through disappointment. Where there has been silence, let your Spirit whisper comfort. Where there has been confusion, Lord, send clarity. May every person listening find the courage to forgive, not because they were wronged lightly, but because grace is heavier than anger. Father, teach us to be still when our hearts want to rush toward vengeance. Remind us that justice in your hands is perfect, and that time in your presence heals all wounds. Just as you restored Eleanor's peace, restore peace to everyone listening tonight. Let your favor rise like the morning sun over every weary soul. For the one who has cried in secret, for the one who feels unseen and unheard, let them feel your nearness now. Replace bitterness with blessing. Replace sorrow with stillness. Replace fear with faith that stands firm. Lord, may every listener leave this moment renewed and reminded that prayer still works, that patience is not weakness, and that silence and faith is louder than any argument. Let hearts be healed, homes be restored, and futures be reimagined through your love. When the storms of life roar again, and they will, Help us remember that you are the calm that never leaves. Father, lift every listener who feels weighed down, and crown them with wisdom, grace, and unshakable joy. In Jesus' mighty name we pray, amen. If that prayer spoke to your heart, I want you to type amen in the comments, not just as a word, but as a declaration that you believe peace, restoration, and victory are already working in your life. Say it with faith. Say it with confidence. Because as surely as morning follows night, God is not done with your story yet.
This brings us to the end of this story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel, and may God bless you for doing so. Bye.